it does create an interesting opportunity for African countries which have both production and refining capacity, such as Nigeria now or Angola, for example, that they could deepen the existing partnerships they have with other African players. So you may know that Ghana and Cameroon recently signed a deal with the Dangote refinery in Nigeria, two different supply deals. Why couldn't that be expanded across the continent? I personally think that the current situation where the Dangote refinery, which is the world's largest single trade refinery, is exporting most of its output to North America and Europe and whatnot. Africa is holding everything up. Everything is standing on Africa's back, and Africa is receiving none of the benefits. I think this is an opportunity to fundamentally reshape how global trade looks like. Now that everyone, especially in the Gulf region, everyone is declaring force majeure every 10 minutes, Africa has the opportunity to do a bit of force majeures of its own.
Welcome to our viewers and listeners. My name is Mamka Anyona. I am the host of A Certain Amount of Madness. You're joining us today on a special episode focusing on the growing crisis in the Middle East, with the US and Israel having attacked Iran just over a week ago. And I am joined today by David Hundeyin, who is a Nigerian journalist and an author. And we will be discussing what the implications for this growing crisis are on the continent. Welcome very much, David.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to begin at a very interesting place. So just about 3 weeks ago, Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State of the United States, was speaking at the Munich Security Conference in a speech that, to everyone who was listening, sounded very much like extolling the virtues of empire and denouncing decolonial forces as dark forces. And he said the following, which I find to be very interesting and relevant to what is happening today. So he said, the fundamental question we must answer at the outset is what exactly are we defending? Because armies do not fight for abstractions. Armies fight for a people. Armies fight for a nation. Armies fight for a way of life. And that is what we are defending, a great civilization that has every reason to be proud of its history, confident of its future, and aims to always be the master of its own economic and political destiny. And exactly 2 weeks after this speech, the Americans or the Israelis or both attacked a primary school in a southern city of Iran called Minab, killing 175 schoolgirls and setting off this conflict that we are now talking about. As of today, at least 1,500 people have been killed, many, many more have been displaced, and there have been attacks in at least 12 countries. So David, maybe let's start from the original sin. What exactly is the history of this conflict? What are the tensions between the actors? Who are the main players? And how do you understand it?
Okay, so a boiled down way of understanding it is that there's an entity in the Middle East, which is to all intents and purposes an unsinkable battleship of this empire. And that entity is known colloquially as Israel. To all intents and purposes, it's literally just a colonial outpost. That's really what it is. It's a huge aircraft carrier that happens to have citizens. And that colonial outpost dominates the entire region of the Middle East. Almost every other country in the region is essentially a vassal of that entity or its parent entity, the United States. And there is one country in the region which, through a confluence of factors, including geography, history, and sometimes by accident, has found itself in a position to be able to stand in opposition to that entity. So Iran is the country that is in opposition to Israel for a variety of reasons. So maybe, I'm not sure I want to go into the story of the Iranian Revolution, but I'll just try to sort of boil it down. Long story short, once upon a time, Iran had what you would call a democratically elected government, all of the good stuff. And then in the 1960s 60s, the decision was made by the US government in partnership with the UK government to stage a coup in Iran because the democratically elected prime minister, Mossadegh, had made the decision to nationalize Iran's crude oil production, such that the economic benefits of Iran's crude oil will be going to the Iranian state and not to British Petroleum. And apparently that was seen as a challenge to the empire. So they overthrew him, and in his place they installed an illegitimate monarch called the Shah of Iran. There's a whole story about the many years of misrule of the Shah, but long story short, in 1979, after years of discontent, a huge cross section of Iranian society came together in what is now known as the Iranian Revolution of 1979, and basically the Shah was forced to abdicate. The country was taken over by this new revolutionary government, which then created what is now known as the Islamic State of Iran. The Islamic State of Iran being that, first of all, the majority of those involved in the revolution were Shia Muslim, and that for any revolution to succeed, there needs to be some sort of unifying ideology that binds everything together. Bear in mind the coalition that made this revolution happen was a very, very diverse coalition. There were communists involved, there were trade unions, there were student groups, there were women's groups, there were all sorts of things. So the closest thing to a unifying thread was the fact that the majority of them professed the Shia Islamic faith. So that became what bound the revolution together, which is how come Iran became the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in the aftermath of that revolution, several attempts were made by the US government to essentially stage a counter coup and to recapture Iran. Most famously, I forget what year it was, a botched intelligence operation was attempted to invade Iran, and basically those involved were caught, and they were held as hostages by this new Iranian government. Those of them who happened to be black, because these were Americans, those of them who happened to be black were released because the Iranian government said, we understand that you guys are victims of empire just like we are. You are not really here by choice, so you are free to go. So they released the black people and the women, and they basically held all the white men. So anyway, that's why we're getting sidetracked now. So long story short, Iran has always been sort of since 1979 has been the counter force in the region. What makes Iran such a formidable adversary to Israel and its parent entity is, first of all, it's almost virtually impossible to invade Iran. Through the accident of geography, Iran is basically it's protected on all sides by all kinds of formidable natural obstacles. So it has mountain ranges across its western coast, and then on its northern border, it has another mountain range, and then on its eastern flank, there are huge, deeply inhospitable deserts, and then it has a coastline which is very, very heavily guarded. And then in addition, it happens to control something called the Strait of Hormuz, which is a choke point that basically I think 25% of the global oil trade flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So essentially, Iran is almost impossible to invade, and Iran has this essentially single-handed capacity to tank the world economy by stopping oil from flowing. So for that, and then also it has also spent decades developing missiles. It has some of the world's most advanced missile and UAV technology. So as a result, as an offensive force, it's formidable. As a defensive force, it's even more formidable. So you can't invade Iran. Iran has the capacity to choke the world economy, and Iran has offensive capacity, as we're seeing now. So for the longest time, even though multiple Israeli governments have had that desire to take Iran off the board, it's simply not been possible. The only US president that has acquiesced to this long-standing request from the Israelis to invade Iran has been the Orange Man, who's in office now. I'm not going to speculate as to why he made that decision. Some would say that he's being blackmailed by the Epstein files. That's entirely possible. I don't know. Some would say that maybe he was overdosed on hubris because the strategy that worked in Venezuela worked so well, so that maybe they expected it to work in Iran, which I would think is a very silly thing because Iran and Venezuela are very, very different countries. Venezuela is a typical post-colonial artificial state. Iran is over 8,000 years old. So, you know, they're just not the same. But for whatever reason, the
Yeah.
decision was made to invade Iran on behalf of Israel, essentially. And that's how come we're where we are right now, where we're at the brink of World War III, because one man in Tel Aviv and one man in Washington, D.C. made a decision that's going to affect the rest of us.
Yeah, well, without going too much into it, I do want to invite you to speculate a bit, especially in terms of the sort of rebalancing of the poles of power around the world. What might be behind, just beyond the personalities involved, what might be behind the sort of institutional decision to take on this fortress that is Iran at this point in history?
Okay, so there are a number of reasons. The first is, as you know, the U.S. empire, like any other empire which is declining, needs to start new wars to reassert itself. Um, you also know that the last time the U.S. won a war in the real sense of it, you would say was the Cold War. And that wasn't a shooting war, that was more of an economic and ideological war. Before and after then, it hasn't actually won a war. It didn't win the Vietnam War. It didn't win World War II, even though it likes to pretend it did. It was the USSR that won World War II. The Iraq War, 20 years and trillions of dollars and, no change in status quo, really. Same thing with the Afghanistan War, 20 years, trillions of dollars, and replace the Taliban with the Taliban. And amidst all of this, the dominance of the US dollar, as you know, has been severely challenged. The US dollar, for those who aren't aware, is the centerpiece of the US empire. So essentially, the US empire is built around exporting the US dollar. So through the mechanics of the global oil trade, a deal that was made in the 1970s was that in exchange for Saudi Arabia and its GCC contemporaries pricing their oil in USD, which would make the USD the global reserve currency, being that it's a global energy currency, that would essentially make the US dollar the strongest and most traded currency in the world, which it is. And by extension, it would then mean that anyone who's conducting international trade has to use the US dollar. So the US government would then have the capacity to effectively outsource its inflation problems and its debt problems to the rest of the world by just printing more money and ensuring that as the global economy grows, everyone is forced to use the US dollar. And that's what has been happening. So, of recent, with the rise of the BRICS bloc and the rise of alternative currencies that make international trade possible. So, for example, between Russia and China, I think something like 90% of their bilateral trade is now settled in their own currencies. They don't use US dollars to trade between themselves unlike before. And there's a risk that the rest of the global south is going to follow in line with the BRICS bloc, which would lead to the decline of the US empire as we know it. So one of the ways to arrest that decline is to strategically eliminate the BRICS bloc as a threat. And how do you eliminate the BRICS bloc as a threat? The two main pillars of the BRICS, which are Russia and China, you have to take them off the board, which is easier said than done. So how do you take China off the board? The first thing is you understand that China's biggest strategic strength is its industrial capacity, its ability to produce cheaply at scale quickly. How do you attack that? Its energy supply. China is the world's largest oil importer. I think 15% of China's imported oil comes from Iran. I think a further 10% came from Venezuela. So you first of all take Venezuela off the board, which they did. Then you go after Iran, try to take Iran off the board, with the goal being that if you've taken a good 25-30% of China's oil imports off the board, then Chinese production becomes more expensive, becomes more difficult, and they lose their competitive advantage. And that's how you slowly degrade them. And then by taking Iran off the board, you're also inching closer geographically. If you can invade Iran, hypothetically, then you then have Azerbaijan and Iran, because Azerbaijan is already aligned. So you then have Azerbaijan, Iran, which are right next to Russia and China, basically. So you've expanded into Central Asia. So it's essentially a chess match that the empire is playing. And that's what all this is about.
Yeah, so coming back to the continent, we have seen the statements released by the Africa Union and by various heads of state. And just to point to two of the statements, the Africa Union commissioner released a statement that seemed to quite explicitly condemn Iran for the violence being witnessed today in the Middle East. The Kenyan president did pretty much the same in more indirect but very clear terms. What do you think about this reaction? And what do you think about its, why is this the reaction that's coming from African countries? And do you think that this reaction will achieve whatever strategic purpose it is meant to?
First of all, I don't think that's the Pan-African position on anything. I think this is the position of certain Africans who, for whatever reason, are constrained to say certain things. First of all, regarding the the AU is not a Pan-African institution. The AU does not represent Pan-African interests, even though that's what it supposedly does on paper. But the AU represents the interests of those who fund it. And unfortunately, a good 85% of the AU's funding comes from outside of Africa. Africa does not fund the AU. So anything the AU says, we can sort of discount it. It's not important. And then with regard to people like the Kenyan president, obviously you know that Kenya is a country which, I mean, it's a country I visit very often and I'm in love with and have some very, dear friends there. So it's not, I mean, I'm not going to come on here and say things that are going to get me arrested the next time I arrive there. But it's a country that has US and UK bases, a military bases on its soil. So to all intents and purposes, its degree and measure of independence is very, very contested. So what else is it going to say? Right. So it is what it is. We have to accept that in Africa, even though the whole continent is under the neo-colonial experience, there is a spectrum of relative sovereignty. Some countries have more relative sovereignty. Some countries basically have no functional sovereignty. So some countries that have more sovereignty, you're looking obviously at the AES, maybe Ghana to an extent, Eritrea if you're looking for a really, really out there example. But countries that have less sovereignty or no meaningful sovereignty are looking at like Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Kenya. It is what it is. These countries are essentially occupied. So that's just the reality. That's not a judgment on the people of those countries or even the leadership of those countries. It's just a material observation of the reality of these places.
Yeah. Well, sovereignty or lack thereof, we are all going to face quite some consequences, especially the longer this conflict draws out. So let's talk a little bit about the Strait of Hormuz and the closing of the strait and what that is likely to do to African countries. They say that oil is projected to go to above $100 a barrel, and that means many more things than just the price of fuel at the pump. Walk us through a little bit of how you see the economic impact of this to be in Africa and across African countries.
So it's a double-edged sword. So for African countries which are not significant oil producers, it's not really good news. So in Ghana, for example, so I live in Ghana for reference, the pump price of petrol is set to basically double. So currently it's about 9 or 10 cedis a liter. It's going to go to like 19. So in terms of like local inflation, that's definitely not good news. However, having said that, it does create an interesting proposition because for the longest time, Africa has been a continent where, despite being a net producer of energy and having some of the world's largest hydrocarbon reserves, for whatever reason, has also been a very large importer of refined fuels. Right. So if we have a situation where the Strait of Hormuz is essentially blockaded, the global oil trade cannot move like it used to. Fuel prices are spiking out of control all over the place. It does create an interesting opportunity for African countries which have both production and refining capacity, such as Nigeria now, or Angola, for example, that they could deepen the existing partnerships they have with other African players. So you may know that Ghana and Cameroon recently signed a deal with the Dangote refinery in Nigeria, two different supply deals. Why couldn't that be expanded across the continent? I personally think that the current situation where the Dangote refinery, which is the world's largest single trade refinery, is exporting most of its output to North America and Europe and whatnot. I personally think that ideally it should be exporting the bulk of its output to the rest of Africa. And I think this crisis has an implicit opportunity to basically reshape the way global trade looks. I think the current state of global trade is a situation where Africa is basically at the foot of everything. Africa is holding everything up, everything is standing on Africa's back, and Africa is receiving none of the benefits. I think this is an opportunity to fundamentally reshape how global trade looks like. Now that everyone, especially in the Gulf region, everyone is declaring force majeure every 10 minutes, Africa has the opportunity to do a bit of force majeures of its own, to get a bigger piece of the pie, because there is a big pie which is baked on top of Africa's resources, which Africa is not benefiting from, because Africa is artificially not permitted to trade within itself. So this is an opportunity to fundamentally reshape that. And I'm looking forward to how, because regardless of whether countries have neo-colonial influences, regardless of how non-sovereign they are, money is money. And money always behaves in a certain way. So when it becomes economically advantageous to act in a Pan-African way, no matter how much of a colonial influence there is, things will move by themselves. So this crisis is obviously not good for the world, because World War III, I don't think World War III is a war that humanity survives. So I definitely don't want World War III to happen. But in terms of a limited impact of this crisis, I think it's an opportunity.
Interesting you think that, because I'd like to run a thought by you that I've been having over the past couple of days myself about the petrodollar. Because the sort of strategy you laid out in which the US attempts to maintain its dominance and dollar dominance through trying to sort of choke off China and Russia, should we assume that that is what they're trying to do, is also a very dangerous move, because it may, and at the moment, it looks like it may end up having the complete opposite effect, because the countries that compose the soul of the petrodollar have been attacked by Iran. And it has been demonstrated in real time that the protection they believed was going to come from the United States for them is simply not going to happen. It is non-existent. And so whatever happens from here moving forward, the Gulf country councils, the Gulf Council country, the GCC, are going to reconsider their relationship with the US. And that may end up completely sinking the petrodollar. And if the petrodollar disappears, that means there's going to be an economic crisis in the United States, the kind of which has not been seen yet. And if dollar dominance is challenged, that also has a direct impact on African countries, which hold a lot of debt that is dollar denominated. So it is, in my mind, this is a sort of double-edged sword where on the one hand, the short-term pressure that comes from increasing commodity prices is going to deepen the debt crisis that is already happening on the continent. But on the other hand, this is an opportunity to completely untie our countries from dollar dependence, and even for the countries that have pegged their currencies against the dollar. This, again, I think is one of those. So tell me what you think about this. How do you see this playing out? And what do you think Africa's position on this is going to be?
As I said, it's an opportunity to fundamentally unwind this very tightly wound set of strictures that make up this global economic structure which Africa is currently subjected to. The petrodollar, for example, I think the potential fall of the petrodollar would be one of the biggest boons to Africa. Because Africa currently, if you think about it, it's a continent where, unlike maybe 30 years ago, obviously, all the resources we know we have today, we knew we had them then, but the technological capacity of Africa wasn't where it is now. Now, as Africa is right now, today, there is the capacity to mobilize resources across borders in Africa. The capacity exists, right? We're not in 1970 anymore. However, for some reason, those resources are not mobilized across borders. There's very little cross-border cooperation going on. And the reason is that to mobilize anything across borders in Africa, to mobilize something from Kenya to Tanzania, there has to be the USD in between. So no matter what quantum of resources that you have to trade, no matter what quantum of people and the sheer economic opportunity that exists there, because they have 35 different currencies on the African continent and each one of them needs the USD as a bridging currency to trade the next man, that is one of the biggest economic handbrakes that is currently keeping Africa like moving very slowly. Take that handbrake off, it's going to shoot off. The economic miracle, I always tell people this thing, the so-called Chinese economic miracle took 40 years. The African economic miracle, given the right conditions, will take 15 to 20 years. We'll do it in half the time. Because we literally have that much wealth and that much capacity and that many people and that much hunger. We do. So the US dollar is one of our biggest problems. If the petrodollar is taken off the table, and then Africa now has the opportunity finally to create, we've already created them, but to implement those Pan-African payment settlement solutions. Bear in mind that for the longest time, we've been talking about stuff like PAPs. And it might not surprise you to know the reason why, even though these things exist on paper, the reason why these things have no real influence out there is because someone has deliberately thumbed the scales, and I think you and I know who that someone is. It's a deliberate thing that is done. Africa must not be allowed to trade within itself without everything being subjected to transactions that are under the purview of the US Treasury Department, i.e. using US dollars. It's a very deliberate thing. I've seen examples of this in real life. I'll give you one example, and this comes from the world of crypto, right? So I have a friend, his name is Ray. He runs he's an Egyptian guy. He runs a crypto exchange called Nuance. Now, Ray was telling me this was a couple of years, 3 or 4 years ago, when Binance, which is the world's largest cryptocurrency exchange, they had an issue. They had a regulatory issue with the US government. So I think their CEO, he got put on trial. He almost got sentenced to jail time. I think he got some kind of deal or something. So at the time, as part of the deal to avoid jail time or whatever, he agreed for the US government to embed people within Binance, like oversight people, to basically have full visibility over what the platform was being used to do, because the accusation was that there wasn't enough scrutiny over the transactions that were permitted on the platform. People were financing terror, all sorts of things. So these people came in, right? And the first thing they did, the very first move they made before anything else, was they went to the P2P. So anyone who is familiar with crypto here knows what P2P is. That's peer-to-peer trading, where someone wants to sell crypto for cash, or you want to exchange cash for crypto. That is like a marketplace where people get to trade, right? The first thing they did was they went to the P2P section that deals with Africa, and they made sure they disconnected the P2P trading that allows Africans to trade with other Africans that are not their own country. So like previously, if you were on Binance as a Nigerian trader, you could trade with a Tanzanian or with a South African, with a Zimbabwean. The first thing they did when they came in was that they stopped it. So as a Nigerian, you can only trade with another Nigerian. So basically, this very thriving, bustling community, and there was a lot of liquidity there, was killed overnight. No explanation was given. And Ray told me the reason they did it is because it was functioning as a proxy for Pan-African trade. Yeah. And that they do not want that. They need every cent of Pan-African trade to pass through the eyes of the US Treasury Department. They need to make a percentage of every cent that moves anywhere on the African continent. And crypto was basically bypassing this as a proxy. So, why the hell should these Africans be creating wealth for themselves outside of our control? Yeah. And so the fall of the dollar would remove that power that they have. Because bear in mind, this is not just power to determine whether you can trade with other Africans. This is even the power to determine whether you can even trade at all. Um, Something that I don't know if you know this Cameroonian Swiss lady called Natalie Yam. She's a friend of mine. So she's currently she's a diplomatic personnel in Nigeria now. She was born in Switzerland to a Cameroonian father and a Swiss mother. Now she is obviously a Swiss citizen and a Cameroonian citizen, right? She was apparently sanctioned by the EU for, I think she attended the some conference in Russia, I think in 2022, and they labeled her as like Russian subversive, all the usual, Red Scare nonsense. And she got sanctioned by the EU. Now, she wasn't in Europe when she was sanctioned. She was right here on the continent where she always is. But those sanctions followed her here. So her local bank here closed her account because if that local bank wants to have access to the SWIFT financial system, which the US controls, the dollar denominated SWIFT financial system, they cannot do business with a sanctioned individual. Her debit cards stopped working for the same reason. So even if you are not directly, like, you don't have a relationship with an American bank or you don't physically use US dollars, just by being part of the global financial system, the US Treasury Department and the OFAC can sanction you out. They can unperson you. They can financially censor you, which is one of the worst types of censorship. They can basically make it like you don't exist. They basically make it such that you don't have any way to have a formal relationship with a bank that is part of the SWIFT network anywhere in the world. They basically sanction you out of existence. That's the power that the US dollar has. So the fall of the petrodollar, which what underpins the power that US dollar has, will be, I think, for Africa to develop, that's actually like a precondition. It's necessary for it to happen.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. In fact, while I agree with you entirely on the sentiments of not wanting World War III to happen because of the toll that it will take on the whole world, if we are to think of a silver lining in all of what has been happening, and especially in this administration that has been willing to take on the fortress that is Iran, is that the rhetoric and the actions make empire very visible, because empire has operated, especially for us on the African continent, empire has operated almost invisibly. In fact, when I was in graduate school in the United States just under 10 years ago, it was really difficult to talk to people about empire and empire's Africa on the empire's effect on the fate of Africa, because you'd always sound like a conspiracy theorist. It's like, what are you talking about? Why are you talking about the World Bank and IMF as these tools of empire? But today, after Marco Rubio's speech, and that's the reason why I think it's such an important speech for every African who is thinking about liberation to listen to, the quiet part is being said out loud. The quiet part is being said out loud. Empire is making itself very visible, and it's much easier to fight a visible enemy than an invisible one. But I think here we've talked about the sort of double-edged sword impact that may come from this crisis. But there's very likely going to be just completely negative consequences on the continent. So, for example, do you think that with all the unrest that we have been seeing across various African countries because of this youth bulge that remains highly interconnected, quite educated, but unemployed, underemployed, very frustrated and alienated, that a combination of the cost of living crisis and just a sense of violence sort of has a way of breeding violence and just creating atmospheres of violence. What do you think? What do you project might happen on the continent in terms of young people organizing themselves or even mobilizing themselves and unrest within our borders?
So it's either of two things. In both instances, there's violence involved. Like it's inevitable. But the first instance is that before it gets to the point of any violent uprising, that there's a critical mass of young Africans who first inform themselves about what the issues are, where the issues are coming from, which is very, very crucial, before taking action. Because that is the only time that the action is going to be meaningful and long-lasting. That's what you then call a revolution. The second scenario is a scenario similar to what happened in Nigeria in 2020, where people are not at all informed about where their problems are coming from, and they don't even fully understand why they're angry. They don't fully understand what they're angry about, and eventually there's like one issue that becomes like a rallying point, and it becomes like this social event that everybody just kind of jumps in without really fully understanding what they should be doing, what this is about. And it goes on for 2-3 weeks, energy flags, and that's it. And then the whole momentum is lost, and everybody goes home and concludes that a revolution in this place is impossible. Right? So I think that the much more preferable scenario is the first scenario, where people first of all understand where their problems are coming from. You wouldn't believe how much of it, I mean, okay, you would believe it because you are African, so you definitely encounter it. How much of a problem it is for people to understand first and foremost why they are angry. Many people just assume that if, say, you have a government that isn't doing the things that you know it should do, it's not providing services, there's unemployment, then that's a simple matter of it being a president who doesn't care, or they're corrupt. So, these very simple explanations that all you just need is an end to corruption, an end to bad governance. Hello? That's not the issue at all. Because the places that don't have these issues of unemployment and poverty, it's not because they're not corrupt, it's not because they have good governance. No, it's because they're extracting from you and they're living parasitically off you. A lot of our people do not understand this. A lot of our people genuinely believe that the US, for example, is the hegemon that it is because of innovation and because of good forward planning and government competence and accountability. That is nonsense. The US is a slave economy built off the back of enslaved Africans, which later morphed into a global empire built off the back of a parasitic currency. That's what the US is, with a military that has how many bases? Is it
800
800
bases
military bases or
across,
something?
across the entire world. Yeah.
To enforce the hegemony of the US dollar and to keep its global empire in place. That's actually how the world works. But our people do not understand this. So, as I said, in Nigeria in 2020, because I was part of that movement that you now know as NSARS, and I was guilty of this, by the way. I'm not absolving myself here. I was very guilty of
Yeah.
this too, where we did not understand what the issues were. So we boiled down all of our frustration and our anger into police brutality, right? Police brutality is just a symptom. It's a symptom of living in a neo-colonial state that never actually decolonized, where your police is set up not to not as law enforcement or as a service, but as an occupationary force, right? That's a direct consequence of living in a non-decolonized space in Africa. We didn't understand this, so we just went to the streets and had a lot of we had an emotional outpouring. We had emotional catharsis, but that's it. Emotional catharsis lasts for like 5 minutes. And then as soon as the soldiers came in with the guns, everybody scampered off. And that was the end of that. And now, 5 years later, we're still wondering, when are we ever going to develop a critical mass of people who are going to hit the streets again? And because we lost that opportunity, because we didn't know what the hell we were doing and what any of that was about. In reality, the issues we were angry about, which we didn't acknowledge or we didn't realize at the time, was we had just come out of a lockdown which was imposed by foreign entities. We had no business locking down in any part of Africa, by the way, but we had gone into a 5-week lockdown which had devastated the Nigerian economy. 60% of Nigerians who had a formal job prior to the lockdown lost the job after the lockdown. Youth unemployment as of August 2020 was touching 70% in Nigeria. So obviously these were the issues that we were actually angry about, which we didn't realize. So as soon as a few viral videos came out of police being brutal with people and stuff, and then we just latched onto it, and that became our whole cause, which in hindsight was not a very smart move to make. So I think the first scenario is the much more preferable scenario, where before there's any action, before any revolution takes place, people first of all inform themselves about where their problem is coming from, who those problems are personified through, and what action specifically needs to be taken to excise these problems. Otherwise, it either just turns into like wanton, random violence, and then you start hearing stories about women getting raped, and like nobody wants to see that. Or, we just fizzle out after a few weeks of pomp and pageantry on the streets. So it's either of those two options, and it's up to us to decide which one it is.
Indeed, indeed. And I think one of the things that we need to also consider as this conflict unfolds is that on the one hand, because for example, the anti-colonial struggle was really helped by the fact of the Second World War. The weakening of the empire in the context of, fighting a war meant that there was room and there was space to sort of like think about, fighting the colonial battle. And there is a scenario, as you say, in scenario one, where this, the fact that empire has made itself visible means it becomes easier to name, it becomes easier to point to, it becomes easier to make people understand that in Kenya, for example, your battle is actually not with William Ruto. Your battle is beyond William Ruto. It is far beyond William Ruto. And the anger you're feeling is because you cannot access things to which you have a right, because those things to which you have a right are being extracted from you. So there's a scenario in which everything that is happening is actually just a petri dish for that acceleration, that forward movement. You know how Lenin says that there are there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. This could end up being that moment for Africa. But there's also an adverse outcome in which we end up under now a second colonial wave. Just in the event that, for example, what is happening in the Middle East leads to a reinvention of empire under a different, under a different epicenter, for example. And I don't want to venture which epicenter that might be. This might very well be a second wave of recolonization across Africa. So, for example, the Gulf countries, especially the Emirates, the Emiratis, Israel, have quite a bit of they have encircled the Horn of Africa. Can we talk a little bit about the Horn of Africa and what? Yes, let's talk a little bit about what is happening on the Horn of Africa, because there's a lot that is happening there that may be invisible to a lot of Africans.
Okay, so first of all, the UAE. Let me focus on the UAE first before we dig into Israel. The most important thing to understand about the UAE is that, with the exception of oil, the UAE has literally no reason to be prosperous. It's geographically poor. The only thing it has is oil. Now, it has these very grand ambitions of being a global. It's built Dubai, being this global center at the center of humanity. It's an 8-hour flight away from anywhere on the three most populated continents in the world: Asia, Europe, Africa. So it has all these grand designs of making itself the center, the geographical center of the inhabited world, even though it really doesn't have the resource base to support any such ambitions. Now, when you have a city like Dubai built out of the desert, entirely out of the desert, a city which doesn't even have like a proper drainage system, because it's literally just built on the sand of the desert, like a completely artificial city, but which you need to become this ocean of prosperity. And then it's right next to what is, in the resource terms, the richest continent on earth, bar none. What do? And then you have oil, and more importantly, you have a geopolitical relationship with the US that gives you the ability to leverage US military power. So you can buy US military equipment and stuff like that. What do you do then? From their point of view, is the answer is you stage a colonial expedition into that wealthy continent. That's what's happening in Sudan. That's what's happening in Somalia, or what was happening in Somalia. That's what's, to a lesser extent, is happening in Kenya, not with violence, but with business. Not just the Horn of Africa, but East Africa as a whole, the Emiratis have very, very grand colonial ambitions for that entire quarter of Africa. Their idea is that, for example, it might interest you to know that the majority of the produce, like the fresh food that is sold in supermarkets in the UAE, comes out of Sudan. Obviously, like less than 5% of the UAE's land is suitable for agriculture, less than 5%. It's a desert. You can't grow food there. So what is sustaining these millions of people that, this artificial population that is created there? It's food coming out of Africa, right? Now they have companies, like basically state-linked companies, that have all sorts of agricultural contracts in Kenya, in all sorts of places where they basically own land in Tanzania and Rwanda, the entire east coast of Africa. They're all over the place. But in Sudan, they've gone a step further, that instead of just renting land from the government like they do across all these other East African countries, or buying land from individuals, that they want to physically colonize at least a part of Sudan. And part of that colonization process involves ethnic genocide, basically ethnic cleansing, clear out the population from like an entire swathe of Sudan, such that it can be controlled by Emiratis for the sole benefit of the UAE. So that will be their farmland. So if you're familiar with the German Third Reich concept of Lebensraum, that's essentially what they're trying to do in Sudan. Lebensraum, living room, right? So that's going to be their farmland. That's going to be their resource base for gold and rare. So again, why is Dubai the epicenter of the global gold trade? UAE does not have a single gold mine within its borders. And the answer is that is gold coming out of East Africa, primarily Sudan. So that's the entire model that the UAE operates. Like they operate a deeply brutal colonial model where, unlike the US model, which makes an attempt to hide itself, it operates indirectly. So it uses the US dollar, right? So the US dollar will break your back, but you're not going to see a white man physically breaking your back. So it's indirect. The UAE doesn't care about optics. They directly send plane loads of ammunition to Sudan, and they know that you can see them doing it. They know that you can track the plane going from Dubai airport to some airports in southern Sudan to offload, or in Chad to offload weapons. They know you can see it. You can track the plane on flight radar or whatever. They don't care. They're doing it very directly, and they go on TikTok live and they say, yeah, ha ha ha, we dream of wiping out you black monkeys. And yeah, they're very, very open about it. So that's the UAE, and that's their desired model for Africa. And by the way, they also have some designs on West Africa as well. It's not just East Africa. They're trying to, if you're familiar with the concept of the so-called carbon trading thing, that's scam. That's the Bill Gateses of this world are trying to popularize. They've bought an entire swathe of Liberia, like Liberian primary rainforests. And essentially the idea is that by owning this piece of primary rainforest here, that whatever pollution takes place elsewhere as a result of their activities will be offset by their ownership of this place. But the big caveat there is, first of all, a foreign entity is owning a huge swathe of what is supposedly a sovereign independent country. That's a red flag. And then number two, that land, basically, even the government of Liberia is not allowed to do anything with it. So the basic sovereignty of the country has been negated, because if for whatever reason, maybe you decide tomorrow we want to construct a power plant here. Yes, there's primary rainforest here, but it's our prerogative as the country entrusted with this rainforest. It's our national territory to decide what we want to do with it. And this foreign entity on another continent can then tell you, no, you are not allowed to do what you want to do on your own sovereign territory. So that's a problem. So that's the UAE. And now with Israel, it's not as in your face, but it's much worse. Because in addition to all those things that I've just mentioned, like trying to use Africa as like living space, trafficking of conflict minerals, and this very neo-colonial use of African farmland, so that Africans are growing food for other people while their own local economy doesn't have access to that food, or they're growing cash crops which they cannot eat to sell into a buyer's market that is controlled by Israeli entities. Apart from all of that, there's also this uniquely monstrous thing going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is almost entirely an Israeli project, where As you know, the DRC is essentially the world's epicenter for extraction of rare earth minerals as we currently have them. So, particularly coltan. Coltan is an acronym. It's columbite and tantalite. Coltan. It's a material that is essential in any kind of lithium-ion battery operation anywhere in the world. So whether it's for car batteries, for electric cars, whether it's the battery on the device that you're using to record this podcast, be it your phone or tablet or PC, whatever it is, all these things have the lithium-ion batteries in them, and they use vast amounts of coltan. And DR Congo is the world's largest source of coltan. You don't need a soothsayer to tell you that despite being the world's largest source of coltan, DR Congo does not benefit from the coltan that it exports for a variety of reasons. The first is that the actual mining process is not controlled and regulated most of the time by the states. Eastern DR Congo, where the majority of this mining takes place, like the Kivu provinces, North and South Kivu, to all intents and purposes, the government in Kinshasa does not control those places. The government in Kinshasa is like a suggestion in those places. In fact, neighboring governments like Uganda and Rwanda have more of a say in what happens in those places than the government in Kinshasa. And then there's all sorts of like UN peacekeepers and then warlords, independent warlords and private security groups. And a lot of these groups are linked to Israel. So I'll give you a statistic that will sound shocking to you, which I didn't believe the first time I saw it, but apparently it's true. What is the city in Africa that has what is the city that has Africa's busiest airspace? Can you think of it?
It cannot be Nairobi or Johannesburg
You would think
or Addis.
you would think Johannesburg, you would think Cape Town, you would think Addis, you would think Nairobi, you would think Lagos, you would think Cairo. No, the city that has Africa's busiest airspace is Goma in Eastern Congo. How does that make any sense? How does Goma, which barely has a functional airport, have the busiest airspace in Africa? And the answer is that all the stuff being extracted, legally or illegally, that's how it's being taken out. So there's all manner of bush runways and unknown airstrips that are in use, and all sorts of unknown aircraft constantly taking off and landing. Some don't even put their transponder on. So if you have some time, if you're familiar with this tool called Flight Aware or Flight Radar, it's like a flight tracking and publicly available thing. Just navigate to East and East Central Africa, and just take a look at how every so often you just see flights that just kind of materialize out of nowhere. Like 2 minutes ago, this flight didn't exist. Now you just find out it's crossing Congolese airspace. It's crossing, like, where did this come from? 9 times out of 10, it's coming from Goma. It's one of the world's largest hubs for all kinds of like illegal aviation activity, with all sorts of players involved, and the bulk of those operations center around Israel. So that is why, just like the way the UAE is the world's gold trading hub, despite not having a single gold mine in its borders, Israel is the world's diamond trading headquarters. In fact, diamonds are Israel's largest single export. You can Google that and fact check me. Diamonds are Israel's single largest export, and Israel doesn't have a single diamond mine within its borders. And we know where the diamonds are coming from. They're coming from the Congo. They're coming from Botswana. If you're lucky, they're coming from all over. And the people who control these spaces all happen to be rich Israeli businessmen. So that's what the UAE and Israel do in Africa. And as you rightly said, if we're very unfortunate, like the world's most unfortunate people, and this turns into a sort of colonial refresh with a new face, potentially it could be even worse than what we've had up till now.
So on that worst note, let's just stay with the idea of DRC, Botswana, South Africa, and Israel. So on January 2nd, there's a Times of Israel blogger, writer who wrote an article about about Africa. And his argument is basically that African countries, this Israeli blogger says, African countries will function better if they are fragmented because, smaller, ethnically homogeneous countries tend to fare better. And in this article, he says, Africa must fragment and South Africa must be fast. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about that because that is very underreported. And the framing of it wasn't necessarily suggestive. It sounded very much like this ought to be foreign policy of certain powerful nations towards Africa. So South Africa is one. They do mention quite clearly, the sort of landscape that they would imagine in a post-fragmentation South Africa. But some of the arguments that were happening in Washington, D.C., when the peace deal was being struck between Rwanda and the DRC was also about fragmentation. And the narrative around fragmentation of the Congo has been around for a very long time. A third nation that seems to have handed itself on a silver platter to the West for potential fragmentation is Nigeria. So let's talk a little bit about this question of fragmentation and this idea that the African Union charters promise to sort of try and respect the borders, be they colonial, to respect the borders so that we can try and create some sort of internal stability, that there are outsiders who are very supportive of separatist and secessionist movements across the continent, and they have the power, they have the army bases, they have the money, the weaponry to make this happen.
So first of all, as far as Israel goes, the fragmentation of Africa is not just a thing that is discussed in Israeli media. It's a project that Israel has been fully involved in and has had success in. So, for example, the country today as South Sudan is an Israeli project. Let's just get that out of the way. Which is not to minimize the sufferings of the South Sudanese people, which were used as the narrative basis for the referendum in 2011. But the very fact that referendum was held, that in and of itself was 100% an Israeli project with American assistance. And the purpose of that was to strategically defund Sudan. As you recall, there was a time when Sudan was a significant pro-Palestine force in the region. Sudan used to send food aid. There used to be sort of, I wouldn't say military aid, but there used to be, what's it called now? Fighters who used to come from Sudan to help with the Palestinian resistance. And just by virtue of its size and its influence in the Arab world, Sudan was seen as a country that needed to be cut down to size. So Israel has found ways to neutralize all of its neighbors already. So the GCC is in Israel's pocket. Egypt has been strategically managed. I wouldn't say it's in Israel's pocket, but it's been strategically managed by virtue of the US involvement there and the fact that the US is Egypt's largest source of foreign aid, like especially military aid. So that has strategically negated Egypt as a military threat to Israel. So that left basically Libya and Sudan as the two African countries in the Arab world that were a strategic threat to Israel. What happened to both of them? Well, Libya wasn't just invaded, it was, to all intents and purposes, partitioned as well, because Libya has competing governments now. And the one presidential candidate who had the capacity to unite Libya was assassinated recently. So you can clearly see someone has an interest in keeping that country fragmented and divided. In Sudan, it went further. The country was actually split into two. And then after it was split, what happened? Both halves immediately fell into civil war. Right? Now, coming down the map a bit further to Somalia, what did we see Israel do recently with regard to the so-called breakaway area of Somaliland? The Israeli government said they are going to offer full recognition to Somaliland. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because Somalia is seen as, if you recall that video by, I think his name was General Wesley Clark, that famous video where he discusses having a conversation shortly after September 11 with someone from the so-called Department of Defense, now the Department of War, the Pentagon, who told him that they're going to take out 7 countries.
Yeah, the Seven
And it
Front
was
War. Yeah.
Somalia, Sudan, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Iran.
They added an eighth in his speech a few months ago. Netanyahu added an eighth, which was TikTok.
Yeah, which they've done, because Larry Ellison, who is basically Israeli, has taken over TikTok with Oracle. So essentially, the Israeli vision for Africa is that Africa should be, if possible, should be like 100 tiny, inconsequential countries that don't have any power to make any material changes on a macro scale, which makes them very easily exploitable and powerless to take any long-term strategic decision. So the existence of large, geographically large and demographically large African countries is viewed as a threat to the empire. So whether that's Mali, just by virtue of its geographical size. So you notice every African country that has either significant geological size or demographic size has one or two secessionist movements. And those secessionist movements, they're always foreign funded. So Mali has the so-called Azawad movement, those people that say they want an independent republic of Azawad. Nigeria, now the Nigerian Civil War ended in 1970. I was born in 1990. I grew up in Nigeria. I lived in Nigeria for the first 17 years of my life. I returned at 23, and I lived there for another 7 years before I left in 2020. Before I was forced to leave in 2020. I didn't choose. I didn't leave voluntarily. So in all my time in Nigeria, this is more than 20 years of lived experience there. There was never a time where secessionism was like at the forefront of any kind of national consciousness. It just didn't exist. There were groups, obviously, or there was a group that purported to agitate for the so-called Republic of Biafra. It existed, but it existed mostly on the pages of like the Saturday newspaper. It was like a thing which nobody paid any attention to. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, in 2012, this young guy, his name is Nnamdi Kanu, just emerges out of the woodwork, literally out of nowhere. He sets up a YouTube channel called Radio Biafra. And in the space of 3 years, between 2012 and 2015, this thing goes from being a YouTube channel to having like an actual pirate radio station in Nigeria where they were able to buy radio transmitters, actual equipment, radio transmitters, and get them illegally installed on telecoms masts. This was the whole thing. So the telecoms provider, MTN, they actually got into trouble for this, but some of their engineers were arrested by the state security. They were found installing transmitters. So they're piggybacking off MTN infrastructure. So where did they get all this money? And then a couple of years later, this guy shows up with the Jewish cap thing on his head at that famous wall in Israel. And it's like, oh, okay, so that's what this is about. Yeah. Somalia, which again, geographically huge, Somaliland all of a sudden starts getting recognition and support and funding, right? Ethiopia, geographically huge, demographically huge, all of a sudden you start hearing, right at the point where Ethiopia was on the cusp of a proper economic breakout. I'm talking like 2017, 2018. The country was really onto something there. All of a sudden you start hearing Oromo this, Tigray that, Amhara the other one. Everybody wants their own separate country all of a sudden. Where did this come from? Yes, we know there've always been tensions there, obviously, but where did this, and then more importantly, where did the funding for the weapons come from? Because all of a sudden, civil war, how? From where? Wars cost money. You don't fight wars with stones, right? No matter how much rhetoric there is, wars cost money. So who is providing the money for this? South Africa, you start hearing about something called Western Cape Independence. And the person driving this Western Cape independence movement is he's not even a South African citizen. He's a British citizen who has South African residency and is involved in local South African politics and is agitated for a part of South Africa to become a white ethno-state, to physically break away from South Africa and become a white ethno-state, right? I could go on. Which other country? Obviously, DR Congo. There's obviously the There's Katanga this, there's Kivu that, issues. Angola, all of a sudden here there's Cabinda this. All of these secessionist movements are not funded locally. All the funding is coming from outside. And then even in my opinion, the most ridiculous example of all, Ghana, which is one of the most peaceful and one of the most ethnically cohesive countries on the entire African continent. It's a country where 70% of the country speaks a single language, Twi, and something like 85% of the country is Christian. So there's very little sectarian or ethnic rancor here. All of a sudden, you start hearing some people talking about Western Togo land and this and that. From where? So clearly the calculation that has been made by these Israeli societal engineers or social engineers who work for the Israeli government is that African countries that have the ability to leverage a large resource base or a large population or both, because really there isn't really any African country that doesn't have a large resource base. So any African country that has the ability to leverage its population is considered strategically to be a threat. Which was also why in 2015, if you recall, just right at the point when Nigeria had already started having its economic breakout. If you recall, Nigeria was the largest economy in Africa at the time. The GDP had just been rebased. Was the third fastest growing economy on the planet, only behind China and Qatar. It was growing at 7% annually. Like everything was on a tear, right? Things were so good at the time that, so I was living in Nigeria at the time. My passport had expired and I didn't bother to renew it because I had no plans of traveling anywhere. Why would you want to be anywhere else? That's how it felt at the time. Like, this is where the action is happening. And right at that point, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this regime change operation, disguised as an election, happens. And within like less than a year, from 7% annual growth, Nigeria is in recession. And then that was in 2015. We're in 2026 now, 11 years later, the economy has shed 60% of its GDP as at 2015. Nigeria is now fourth in Africa, heading for fifth. So every time there's an African country that has either the demographic or the economic ability to break out, something happens. And it's not by accident.
Indeed. And by the looks of it, there is no Pan-African movement that is happening that is at all, again, goes back to what you said about the Africa Union not being a Pan-African entity or even an African entity for that matter. And so there's no real organic liberation movement that can bring us together, because the only way that we actually end up, improving our lots in this entire contest and this whole realignment is through unity, not through division. So we're coming to the end of this. There's so much more that I want us to talk about, but we're out of time, unfortunately. But I want you to tell me what you think. So there are various ideas being lobbed out there by thinkers, commentary pundits, and otherwise about what is happening. Some see what's happening in the Middle East as just a temporary war, another 12-day war is all going to be over. Things will sort of like go back to an uneasy calm in the next couple of weeks. Others think this may end up being just another Afghanistan drawn out for, a couple of years, but nevertheless sort of contained within the Middle East with just a few changes here and there. But then there are those who very much say that this is the beginning of World War III. And in so doing, they're sort of like looking at all the different forces, all the different countries that are involved, all the different forces that are playing out, the various continents which are being touched by the current conflict, and even the conflicts that are brewing. For example, what is happening in Cuba and the fact that the American government seems very intent on invading Cuba. Tell me what you think. I'd like to hear what you think. And also, while answering that question, tell me whether you think of this, should it play out as the Second and First World War? Is it a European war, or is it actually a world war?
So let me start with that question. There's no way it would just be a European war. And I should also correct the impression that the Second World War or even the First World War were European wars, because Africa is always dragged in. For whatever reason, it's not part of World War II history that is regularly told, but hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of African troops were directly involved in World War II. So there were thousands of young African men that were taken out of the English colonies, specifically, so from Kenya, from Ghana, from Nigeria, and the hundreds of thousands, and they were sent to Myanmar, which was then known as Burma, to go and die at the hands of the brutal Japanese at the time. And then when they came back, when the Kenyans came back, they found out that their land had been expropriated and given to white British settlers. When the Nigerians and Ghanaians came back, the pensions and pay they were promised, they didn't get paid. And then the British shot them dead in the streets for protesting about it. Same thing was done to the French colonies. The French did even worse. The French extracted hundreds of thousands of young men from Senegal and whatnot. And those were the people who actually physically defended France from actual invasion. So France literally owes its existence to African soldiers in World War II. So it was not a European war. We were dragged in. In fact, a fun fact I always like to mention is that the two bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the uranium that was used to make those bombs was mined at the Shinkolobwe mine in DR Congo. So World War II wasn't just a war that was fought over the colonial split, who was going to get what part of Africa, because that was really what both world wars were really about. But it wasn't just that. It was also a war that directly involved African people and African resources. And in fact, there were some battles of World War II that were actually fought on African territory, especially in North Africa. So that's just to correct the impression that there was ever a time when Africa was left untouched. That never happened. In fact, it might also interest you to know another fun fact, also during World War II, that the west coast of Africa, between like Liberia and like Nigeria, Togo, both the British and the Germans, who were on opposite sides of the war, used to go there to restock. So the German U-boats would go to the coast of West Africa, the places they controlled, like Cameroon and Togo, and they would restock, they would refuel, take on all that they needed. The British would bring their ships to Nigeria, to Ghana, to Liberia, Sierra Leone, Gambia. They would also restock there. They would be aware of each other's presence, and there was a strategic truce there that they wouldn't engage there because that was the place they went to extract. So let's not destroy our mine and our garden where we're going to block stuff from our farm, right? And then when they got back into European waters, then they would engage. So Africa was always part of it. Now, in the event of this becoming a world war or a full regional war, which would then make it a world war, Africa would not just be involved in those at the fringes, the way it was in World War II, or through extraction. But in this case, I have every reason to believe that even the continental Africa itself will be a theater of war. There's no way to get past this time around, because if you think about it, why are so many Israeli or Israeli linked entities furiously buying up land across Africa now, specifically in Kenya and South Africa? Why are they doing that? They're not. You don't. If you knew in advance that there's a war that is coming, and they are buying up land in a certain territory, that means that you have plans for that land. That means that you intend to settle there, probably make it your new homeland. And you also know that the people who are native to that place are not going to watch you do that. They're not going to be, okay, yeah, please come and dispossess us of our land. Yeah, I mean,
the Palestinians did that. They said, "Oh, come in, let us protect you from
Kenya fought a whole, Mau Mau war over land, right? As did the South Africans, as did, most Africans really. So they know that there's going to be conflict and they're preparing for it. So Africa will be a theater of conflict. So I don't think there was ever a time when Africa was shielded, and I don't think it's going to be now. Now, the first question, which was that, do I think it's going to develop to that stage, or it's just going to be like a storm in a teacup? My heart would say that I hope it ends maybe it continues just long enough to give Africa an opportunity to unwind some of these unfavorable economic deals that it's in. But my head tells me that when an empire is declining, it stops being rational, and it's willing to take down the entire world with it. So we've seen reports of the US Navy, I think it is, or the US Air Force, either the Air Force or the Navy, sending in is what is known as the Doomsday Jet to the Middle East. It's the jet that sends signals to the nuclear submarines that basically tells them when and if to launch nuclear missiles. Now, if we're at the point where, even if they're not actually going to use nukes, but if we're at the point where nukes are being paraded, like physically paraded in the face of an enemy as a threat, like we are going to nuke you, that in and of itself is an escalation beyond anything we have seen in our lifetime. Because even at the height of the Cold War, even during the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis, there was never a time where the US sailed nuclear submarines to hostile coasts and sent the Doomsday Jets overhead and made sure everybody knew. I don't think that ever happened during the entire Cold War. But we're at that point now. And then who is in charge in the US? Who is in power in the US? I think for me, the most illuminating thing to come out of this Epstein files, what's the word I'm looking for now? What I found most interesting in all of this is realizing that the real power behind the power, the real people who are actually in charge of the world, they have no rules. There is no adult in the room. There is no, okay, this is as far as this can go, and someone has to push back on this. That mechanism does not exist. These people have no limits. They have no rules. They are willing to do anything and everything. If you can eat babies, you can physically eat a human child. What can't you do? If you can physically and knowingly eat a human child, torture a human child, watch it go through pain, hear and experience that awful experience, and physically eat human meat, then are you going to hesitate to push a button that will kill 2 million people? That means in your mind, you've already transcended the concept of human life having any sort of value or sanctity.
In fact, I found it very telling that the first attack was on a girls' school, young girls.
Exactly. I don't think that was an accident. We've seen a news report come out recently that school was actually bombed twice. So it couldn't even have been a mistake. It was intentional.
It was a double tap. Yeah, indeed. So we have to end on a bit of a positive note because we have to tell our people what to do at this time. So I would like you to give, I don't know, for our listeners and viewers, to give some sort of guidance on what to be thinking about and looking out for in the next phase, and also tell them where to find your work online and elsewhere.
So when you say the next phase, you mean what happens?
The coming weeks. In the coming weeks and months, it is going to be important for us to start thinking differently and to start acting differently.
So I guess the most important thing for people who, because I noticed, I don't know if this is a problem in East Africa, but I can always speak for West Africa. I noticed that the biggest problem we have here is that there is this very obstinate and obdurate refusal to engage with the reality that exists. A large majority of people here have decided that the world that exists is this and that narrative, and they are willing to defend those narratives to the end of time. And evidence is not enough to change their mind. So, for example, there are those who believe that the very concept and idea of neocolonialism is a conspiracy theory. At this point in time where we're seeing the US Secretary of State come out and tell you to your face that we are the heirs to a proud civilization that colonized the earth, and we don't want our allies to be burdened by guilt or shame. He's basically telling you to your face that, yes, we did all the things we did to these worthless people, and we have nothing to be ashamed about because they are worthless. So if you can see a US Secretary of State telling you that to your face, and you can still deny it to yourself, that colonialism is basically your biggest problem as an African, then that means that your entire frame of reality is fundamentally broken, and you can never arrive at the wrong decision. You can never make the right choice. You can never arrive at the right decision. You can never make the right choices. So from our point of view in West Africa, I don't know if it's the same way you are, but from our point of view, the most important thing
Yes, it
is
is.
to educate ourselves, because we are deeply, deeply, deeply uneducated, and those of us who consider ourselves to be educated are miseducated. And because we are miseducated with a whole bunch of wrong or irrelevant information, we have a huge ego that makes us fundamentally unteachable, which is like the biggest problem that we have, specifically in terms of Anglophone West Africa. So something will need to change there, because the period in human history that we're getting into now is probably the most dangerous of our entire lifetime so far. The world is shifting fundamentally, and those are the kind of shifts where if you don't know who you are, what you stand for, and you don't know where you are going and what to do to get there, you will end up as roadkill. So I think that's the most important. The most important step is psychological. That first of all, we all need to know and accept that you are not a Westerner, you're not a European, and you're not an American. Even if you have a passport and you live there, you're not one of them. You're not you're not a Christian primarily or a Muslim. You're not any of these descriptors. You are an African, and that in the world of geopolitics, that is all that it's possible for you to be. Everything that happens to you will always boil down to that. That the people in Sudan who consider themselves to be Arab and Muslim hasn't stopped them from being genocided as the Black Africans that they are. Right? The people in Nigeria and in some cases in Kenya who are under the very mistaken impression that they are Christian in the same sense that someone like Charlie Kirk is a Christian, or that they're Zionists or they're Jews or whatever, that all these pretensions, you will be disabused of these notions very quickly and very violently and very disrespectfully. So people need to understand that the only identity that you have that means anything in the world is the one that you have no control over whatsoever, which is the basic fact of you being African. You didn't choose to be African, you just are. And that's all the world can fundamentally ever see you as. So you have to defend your perimeter to ensure that your being African doesn't make you end up as roadkill. You have to defend, protect your African interests, identify what your African interests are, and protect those interests. Nothing else matters.
Okay, thank you so much. And where can we find your work, David?
So I'm on most major social media. I'm on Twitter at same handle at David Hundeyin, Instagram at David Hundeyin, Upscrolled at David Hundeyin. Yeah, YouTube, you can search me out there as well.
Thank you so much. This has been quite a wonderful conversation amidst really tumultuous time. I suspect we'll have to talk about this again as things unfold. So we welcome you back on the show anytime. Thank you so much, and goodbye for now.